Hello and welcome back. This is Chris with Marksman Shooting Sports in Westfield, Indiana, and you are watching Marksman TV. Today's video is a tabletop review and comparison of the HK91 and the FN-FAL as made by FN in Belgium and imported by Steyr. This is going to be a pretty good representation of the original German G3 and then the original FAL, as these are the closest civilian import models that you can get to their original counterparts. Again, these are both pre-banned guns, which were imported between the 60s and the 80s respectively, depending on the model and the years, of course, that they were brought in. As mentioned, we will do a tabletop side-by-side comparison, moving through all the different functions and the configurations of each. Stay tuned, that's coming up right now. Now, typically I start off videos like this with a historical overview. I will touch on a little bit of their development and history, but I do have videos up right now that do talk about the G3. I do have a video of the HK91 in comparison of the PTR91, and also the PTR91 in comparison with the SETME version, which is actually the Century C308 that I used in that video. In both of those videos, I go into very elaborate history on both of the SETME really and the G3, and then into the import models, the HK91 and the PTR91. So I will leave links to those videos if you want to go check those out. As far as the FN-FAL, this is the first video I've had featuring one of these, but my next video that I will be updating in a week or so is going to be specifically on the FN-FAL, and we'll delve into a very deep and in-depth history and development statistics on these when we do that video. Now, briefly starting off, a little bit of back history on these. Now, the FAL was originally, of course, designed, and the first prototypes were made by FN in Belgium, and they were the first original manufacturer of the FAL platform. Subsequently, over its many years of service, and actually it has been in service in varying countries between 1953 and up until current day, this has been used in a wide array of countries, including Germany, Israel, Canada, Great Britain, Australia, Brazil, Argentina, even the United States, just to name a few. And of course, those different patterns do have slight variations. So as I go through the specs of these, keep in mind that, of course, depending on the many patterns you're looking at, there are going to be some slight differences, whether it's an inch pattern or a metric pattern, what type of receiver it's using. The flash hiders were different, the sights, the handguards, the furniture, even the placement of the disassembly latch, whether they were issued as military rifles as a select fire or semi-automatic only. Again, I'm going to delve really deep into that in an upcoming video when I just talk about the FAL. Now, coming up into the German HK91, the original variants are actually, it was designed by Ludwig Vollgrimmler, who was a German, and then it went into service first with the Spanish under the name SETME, and then there were the different models. The Model C is the most common, and then later developments into the SETME Model L, which is a 5.56.223. Again, I have really elaborate history on that in our previous videos. Now, the interesting thing that ties these two together is the original G3 was also in production really as the SETME in the late 40s and early 50s, and it did go into service as the G3 in 1958, again until present day, in various countries. Now, after World War II, of course, Germany was divided, and you had the Bundesgrundschütze, which was the standard German army, and actually they did adopt a pattern of the FAL, which was known as the G1. And then you had the Bundeswehr, which was the new German army, who was looking into adopting the variation of the SETME, which later turned into the G3, which is in this configuration you see. Now, they did have the G3A3, which had the full-length stock, and I do have a PTR91, which does have that full stock on there, so this would be in the A3 configuration with the collapsible stock. This is known as the G3A4. And then, of course, the Bundeswehr did adopt this as, the G3, the G3A4, A3, G3A3, G3A4, sorry. And then it did take some time before the whole of Germany did adopt the HK91, with the G1 being the official service rifle of Germany up until the adoption in 1958 of the G3. Now, I do have a G1 FAL coming in, which I will use in my next video, so we'll touch a little bit more on that later. I would also like to do a video showing the development of the different German rifles over the years, and so we'll use that G1 to demonstrate that as well. Now, early prototypes of the FAL were chambered in a couple different cartridges. Now, again, coming off of World War II, the German Army did have the Sturmgewehr 44 STG 44, which was chambered in the 7.92 by 33 millimeter Kurz, which is one of the primary rifles. It was really meant to be an intermediate cartridge that the FAL was going to serve in fulfilling it as an intermediate cartridge. Also, British development did want a variation chambered in the 280 British, and they did make that as a developmental cartridge as well. However, the final derivations of the FALs that became widely used were chambered in 7.62 by 51 NATO, which is also the exact same chambering of the G3 or the HK91 as well. Moving into the general specifications, we will go ahead and start up here with the HK91. It does have an overall length of 40.38 inches with a barrel length of 17.71 inches or 18 inches and a weight of 9.7 pounds. The FAL in its standard configuration as we see it here is a total length of 44 inches, a barrel length of 21 inches, and a weight of 9.5 pounds. Now again, I did mention this before, these were made in many different configurations. This right here would be the standard representation of what the finalized main pattern design, which was the Belgian 50.00 design configuration would be. So this would be the standard model. Of course, like I said, they did have fully automatic versions of the FAL, which did fire at a rate of about 700 rounds per minute. And then the G3s were all fully automatic, and they did fire at a rate of about 500 to 600 rounds per minute. Other variations of the FAL as made by Belgium, of course, this is the 50.00. Then there was the 50.63, which was the paratrooper version, which did have a folding skeletonized stock and a shorter barrel. And then you had the model 50.64, which did have a folding stock and a standard length barrel. And then the 50.41, which is also known as the FAL H-bar or the FALO, and it did have a heavy barrel bipod and did use an extended magazine. Now let's go ahead and talk about the barrels. I'll go ahead and start up here with the HK91. Now it is an 18-inch barrel, and up at the front you do have a standard birdcage flash hider with 6 vent holes, and it is held in place by a little C-clamp at the rear of the flash hider here. The thread pitch on the standard G3 as well as on the HK91 is 15x1 right-hand threads, and the barrel is a 4-groove 1-in-12 right-hand twist, again same as the G3. Now it does use a tapered profile barrel, and it does have a fluted chamber. So when you do fire these things, when you basically the ejection is very heavy and very harsh on the brass. If you pick up a spent casing, you will see the imprints from the fluted chamber in your brass as well. So something interesting to look at there. The FAL, on the other hand, had a standard barrel length of 21 inches. You are going to notice this very large, reminiscent of a birdcage flash hider, similar to what you see on like an M14 or an M1A. They usually came in 2 standard flash hider lengths. This is the longer version, which of course was standard. They also had a shorter flash hider version as well. So the standard thread pitch on an FAL was 9/16 by 24 right-hand threads, and it did have a twist rate of 1.305 millimeters, which is roughly 1-in-12 inches. Here you will see the sling swivel mounted up here, actually attached to the barrel itself. Again, on different variations, the location of that sling swivel would change. Now, moving back up here into the sights, I'll go ahead and start with the G3 variant on the HK91. So on the front here, we do have a fixed post with a protective hood encompassing it here. And then right up here in front of it, there is a little slightly detented plunger here, and that would be where you would affix the locking point on your bayonet. Also here on the G3 variant on the HK91, this is where you would attach the forward position of your sling. Now here on the FAL, you do have a standard front post, and you have 2 short protective ears here on either side. Now different variations had different height on these protective ears. This is of the shorter variant. Up here is your gas plug, and I will show you when we get into the function how that basically works, also during disassembly, to show you basically how the gas system works. So here we have the handguards, and up here on the G3 version, there's basically a couple of variants of these. You did have the larger triangular handguards, and of course you see these openings here which would allow you, when you had your bipod up the front, you could close those legs and they would rest in here in these notches. This is also fully heat shielded, and it is a little bit heavier than the standard original thin profile that you see on other G3 rifles. This, of course, here would be the standard thin G3 variation on the handguard. Now, keeping it attached, there is a little push pin here, which I just pushed in, which you usually see on a lot of HK products. You can grab it from the other side, pull out, and then the handguard will pop off here on the front, and then off the back. And then here we have the barrel and the cocking tube exposed up here. Now, the FAL did use traditionally two-piece handguards, basically on all of their variations. This is a plastic, like a Bakelite type feel to it, and also you will see these grooves in here, which is also meant to house the legs of a bipod, which you could attach to the rifle, of course. To remove the handguards, there is a flathead screwdriver screw here. So I will go ahead, and I have a flathead screwdriver. I'll go ahead and remove that so we can see what it looks like with the handguards removed. And with those two separate pieces removed, these are the handguards, and as you can see, they are not heat shielded. Now, the handguards themselves, you can see, are a completely different profile. The FAL is definitely a lot thinner and sleeker and just easier to kind of wrap your hands around. This variation of the HK91, or I'm sorry, the G3 handguard is definitely heavier. It is heat shielded, which is good, especially if it's a fully automatic machine gun. And just a little bit more robust and a little bit larger to get your hands around. Not a big deal. Of course, again, the Germans did develop a thin, slim, sleek profiled handguard for the G3, which I previously just showed you. Now, although these look very similar, they are very different in how they function. So this actually, on the G3, it is a roller delayed blowback, and this up here, usually people will get it confused and think that it is a piston tube or direct gas impingement, or basically gas as you're traveling through here. That is not the case. This is not a gas port. People also think the little thing I showed you up here was like a gas plug. It is not the case. Of course, it's just the retaining portion for your bayonet. I will show you this when we get into disassembly, but basically on the bolt carrier itself, there is a little arm that sticks about this far up. The cocking tube, actually more about this far up, the cocking tube. And then the charging handle, which is actually up here at the front, that's where it engages. So when you pull this to the rear and then pull back on the cocking handle, it engages that plunger or that arm, which then pushes the bolt carrier to the rear. Of course, this is non-reciprocating and does stay downward in the lock position during firing, but the bolt is free to reciprocate, of course, as it fires. Also, when I disassemble it, I'll show you how the actual bolt system works and how, what it basically means, roller locking delayed gas blowback, and basically what that means. Now, the FAL, on the other hand, this is actually a gas tube because this is a short stroke gas piston. So the difference is this is actually a gas block, and like I told you up here at the front, this is your gas plug. So that can be removed, and then we can drop our gas piston and spring out of this tube, which I'll show you when we get into disassembly. But what basically happens is there is a gas port here, and gases will travel through the barrel, be diverted up through the gas block, and then back through here, and it will hit a piston, a short stroke gas piston, which does actuate the bolt carrier to the rear, and that's basically how it functions. So direct gas blowback, gas piston, short stroke gas piston here. Now, this could be one of the main contributors to why people say if you've ever fired an HK91 or a G3 versus an FAL, people will unanimously agree that the FAL does have lighter recoil. I liken that to, say, the difference between a pump shotgun and a semi-automatic shotgun. What's happening is a lot of your gases are being reverted back to actuate your action, so that's not being blown directly back into the shooter like it is on an HK91. 100% of your gases are moving rearward to actuate the bolt, so it is moving at a very quick and very violent speed, I should say, which also you can see when you're firing, it'll throw your brass out several feet and usually ding it and dent it out because it does have very violent extraction and ejection, again because of that, all those gases coming back to actuate the firearm. And of course, here on the FAL, a lot of your gases are lost in the actuation of the firearm, so you're not getting those directly back into the shooter. Now, also up here, usually on gas systems, you need to be able to adjust them. So this may be difficult for you to pick up, but right here at the tip of my thumb there is a little gas hole, and it's partially covered by this knob. What happens is you can turn this knob, and as you turn it in one direction it covers the hole more and more, and as you turn it in the other it backs away from the hole more and more. So what essentially is happening, I'll try and diagram this for you. So imagine the width of this paper is the width of the gas tube, and then right up here at the top of the gas tube there is your gas port hole. And then with the screw, that little screw we talked about, completely backed off, it's sitting here, and the gas block or the gas port hole is completely open. What that basically means is gas is reverting up through the gas block and starts coming back through the gas tube. 100% of your gases blow out and basically out the top of the gas tube, and none of them are reverted back to your action. If you turn that little knob one click, it then moves up to this position, and now, you know, maybe 10% of your gas port hole is covered up by that little screw. So now you're just getting a little bit of gases pushing back through that tube, as most of them are still coming out the hole. You turn it another click, now you're covering about 30% of that hole. So still a lot of gas bleed off through the top of the gun, but still some of them are now being reverted back. You turn it another click, now you're covering about half, and this is typically in the position where the gas block would want to be on a purely clean gun if you're just using military ball ammunition. So half of your gases are bleeding off, the other half are reverted through the gas tube to push your piston and actuate the gun. Now as the gun starts fouling up and getting dirtier and dirtier, less gases are getting through the gas block anyway, so you want to capture as much of those gases as you can. So you'll go ahead and turn it another click to allow less gas bleed off and more gases through the tube. Now say your gun's completely gunked up and there's very little gases at all coming up through the gas block because it's just so carboned up. You might close off the gas hole entirely, and so that any gases that get through that gas block can actually continue through the gas tube and actuate the piston. Now I will show you more specifically how that piston works when we get into the disassembly. But this is why it's important if you have an adjustable gas system. You're shooting on a completely clean gun, and you've maybe never fired it before. With standard military ball ammo, you don't want to start with that gas piston completely open, because what will happen is with it completely closed, because what will happen is you're going to put 100% of your gases through the gun, and if that's too much pressure or power on the gun, that can really beat up your receiver quite a bit. So hopefully that little diagram helps explain basically how that gas port works. So again, to recap, the bullet is fired, travels down the barrel, followed by gases. Bullet leaves the barrel, gases behind the barrel start going up through there's a little hole here between the in the gas block to divert gases up through the barrel up into the gas tube. Gases start traveling rearward past the gas port hole, which is right here. Any gases you've allowed to bleed off will through the top of the gas tube, and then excess gases still remaining will travel down the tube, hitting your piston, and then the piston will send the bolt flying to the rear, and that's how it works. Now, depending on the variation of the FAL, you can also find these made out of metal, and usually like on the German G1, and you can also find these made out of wood. Now, conversely, the cocking tube here on the HK91, of course, serves no purpose other than to house the charging handle. So, of course, how that works is you pull the charging handle open, then pull it back. Now, there is no bolt hold open even on an empty magazine, so as long as you're not pushing this up into the catch notch, which is up here, that's how you would hold the bolt back. That's where you get the famous HK slap pattern like that sends it home and locks it. But as long as there's, you're not doing that, it's just free to reciprocate. Of course, it only reciprocates when you pull on it. It does not reciprocate during firing. Now, the cocking handle on the FAL is this knob. Typically, you find a knob on the metric pattern guns like this, and just like a small charging tab on a inch pattern, and I'll try and roll in a picture of that. But you can find either variation on either pattern, especially because these are usually mainly built by people off of kits anyway. So how this basically works, it's also non-reciprocating, so there is a magazine hold open, so if there is a mag inserted and we open it, of course it will lock to the rear if the magazine is empty. And this is also non-reciprocating, so you now see it's loose, so you have to return the charging handle after, if you want to keep the charging handle in the forward position, return it, and it will lock into a little recess here, and the bolt is still open, and of course I can open that up. Now there is a bolt release here. There's two levers. One's our mag release, one is our bolt release. So I can return that, of course, and then push on the bolt release, and that was in the bolt home. The magazine release is a little lever right under here, so if I'm firing the weapon like this, I can theoretically reach up here with my trigger finger and push on that to dump the magazine. With the magazine out of the rifle, of course, it is free to reciprocate and there is no hold open actuating the bolt. Now on the HK91, the magazine release button is here, and typically you would find a paddle right here too. Either way, you do need to either roll your hand off the grip to actuate the button here to drop your magazine, and or you could use your supporting hand to just basically tilt the gun up, pull your other hand over here, and grab the magazine and hit the magazine release. It's kind of hard to do this on camera, but basically, you know, I think you get what I'm trying to say. Now moving into the receivers, I'll go ahead and start up here with the HK. So the HK G3s were stamped steel and then rolled and then welded. They are a little bit beefier, of course. You look at the receiver, it is quite a larger footprint than here on the FAL, so a little bit larger. Of course, that's going to add a weight and everything there too. The rear sights were welded onto the top of the receiver. And of course, you see these little detents, which is how a claw mount would then attach to that. Now, the receiver and the trigger housing are two separate components, and I will show you that when I disassemble the rifle. Whereas on here on the FAL, you do have two different receiver components. You essentially have the upper receiver and the lower receiver. And, you know, very similar in terms of concept. So you do have a hinge point here. The G3, there would be a pin through here. The civilian HK91 does not have that pins. There's just a shelf, so this will detach right off, which I'll show you. And of course, here on the FAL, you do have a hinge point as well. So the concept is actually very similar. Now, here on the HK91 or on the G3 variant, there weren't too many different variants of the receivers. If we get out of the SETME, you know, the different SETME models, the prototype models and that, but the final standard variation of the G3, which was put into service, you just basically have a stamped and rolled and welded receiver, and then the finish was a military parkerizing. Now on the import model like this, on the earlier imports, you did see a bluish gray finish, which is really more for the civilian market to give it more of that sportsman type look and finish and sheen to it. But on the military variations, of course, you saw more of a parkerized finish, much like the finish on this PTR 91 GI model. So it's kind of got that military parkerizing. Now, receiver variations on the FAL is a little bit more convoluted than on the G3. So there are basically three different receiver variations or types. There was the Type 1, which was the original variation, which came about in the 50s, and of course it had sort of the differentiating features, and I'll roll in some pictures to describe this, but on both sides of the receivers you had full lightning cuts to basically lighten up the rifle. Now, it did take a lot more time to produce and machine those parts, you know, the receiver parts, but of course it was to help in lightening up the overall weight of the gun. But of course your downside of that is your increased production time. Also, on the opposite side here on the magwell, you did have a lightning cut here to just, again, lighten up the load where they could to make the firearm a little bit lighter. The Type 2 receivers came about in the 60s, and the Type 2s also had the lightning cuts both on the magwell and on the sides of the receiver, except towards the rear. How you'll know it's a Type 2 is towards the rear, the lightning cut progression stopped, and they left a rear portion of the receiver without the lightning cuts in it. That was to leave the rear of the receiver more reinforced, because during a lot of excessive fire, especially on fully automatic, you got a lot of reciprocation of the bolt slamming into the back of the receiver, and with those lightning cuts they did find it was not as durable, so they left those cuts out towards the back of the receiver to give extra reinforcement to increase the service life of the receiver. Now, the Type 1 and the Type 2 were forged receivers. Then you get into the Type 3, which came about in the 1970s, which is what this is, a Type 3, and there are no lightning cuts at all, so none on the either side of the receiver and none on the magwell. Again, this was done to basically make production costs and time a lot more reasonable as a service weapon. They didn't see the lightning cuts. Actually, they did see in the Type 1s that it did decrease the rigidity of the receiver. So by leaving those lightning cuts out, you save production time and cost, and actually you have a more durable receiver in the long run anyway. But then in later production of the Type 3s, I think in around the 80s, what they started doing was investment casting instead of forging of the receivers. So again, a little bit counterintuitive. It did, of course, decrease production costs and time, but since it was an investment cast, they did say that the standard Type 1 and Type 2 receivers could handle up to about 80,000 rounds. On the Type 3 investment cast receivers, you're looking at about 40,000 round service life, which is still a pretty high service life. I mean, it's still a pretty high round count, especially if you're just in the military with a cast receiver. You just ditch the gun and issue a new one, so it's not a big issue. Now on the commercial market and like the DS Arms production guns today, as well as the Kunin guns, I believe that those were built on the Kunin receivers out of American Arms Corp, which is actually what the G1 is that will be coming in that I'll do a more extensive video on. Those would be Type 3 investment cast receivers. Now some other features of the receiver is, of course, you do have a carry handle here, which is pretty indicative of what you'll find on a lot of FALs, whether issued in the light machine gun roll or not. Also, back here towards the rear, this is your latch to open up the receiver. There are basically two variants. You see this one here, and you push up on the knob here to separate the two halves, which I'll show you in a minute. Also, there is one with a latch up here. So you'll find both styles if you're looking into purchasing an FAL. So just know that there's two ways to field strip the gun, basically. So your safety selector, of course, this was a civilian import gun. So you do have down here in the bottom position is your fire position, and then up here at the top is your safe. Now on the military variants, you will have a third position, which will usually be over here, which is your fully automatic, and that's why you see it cut out here in the pistol grip. So that selector would actually swing all the way around past the pistol grip down here into the fully auto position. Now, a lot of people do have problems with built FALs, and I'll get into all this difference between built and imported and all that FALs in the FAL dedicated video, which will be coming up next in a week or so. But usually when they're built, they have their full auto trigger packs with the 3-position selector, just no sear, the safety sear, or the cutout in the receiver. Sometimes that can cause problems with the firing mechanics. Again, that's simplified right now. I'll get into that in another video. Now on the HK91, you typically can find a carry handle up here, which I do have the carry handle, it's just not installed on this rifle. The safety selector here is just a 2-position, F for fire and up to S for safe. Go check out our last video on the HK91 versus the PTR91. I get really into the depth of the different selectors and everything when it just comes to HK91 import models. Now the PTR91 I have here does have the more common G3 selector positioning here on the safety selector. Now this is of course semi-automatic only, and the E and the F fire both in semi-automatic, but you have the S up here is in the safe position. E would be semi-automatic, E meaning Einzelfeuer or Einzelfeuer, which is single shot, and then down here into the bottom position, F for Feuer, or sorry for the bad German, but anyway, that would be your fully automatic setting. Now, of course, like I said, these are both semi-automatic fire positions. Okay, moving into the rear sight. Here on the HK91, you do have an aperture drum sight. So basically back here where my thumb is, there is a little dip, and you would have a sight adjustment tool which would lock into 2 recesses in the back of the sight, and you can make gross adjustments doing that. Once you would get it dialed into about 100 meters, you can then remove that sight tool, and then you have your 200, 300, and 400 meter aperture settings. You would basically just turn the drum to your different sight specifications based on the range you're firing at. Now, the sighting system on the FAL can be a little bit convoluted, and again, the sights change based on the country of origin, as they each have their own specified, kind of a configuration on the rear sight as well as on the front. But basically, you have a sliding rear aperture, so it stays in the upward position, and you can slide along a graduated ramp by pushing in the button here on this side. That will free the sight aperture, allowing it to move. And this one is 1 to 600 meters. So the trigger here on the FAL is actually quite nice. You'll start off with just a little bit of take up there, and you see kind of a fire plunger here on the back. So a little bit of take up, not very much movement, and then into a nice clean break at about 6.5 to 7 pounds. Now going into the reset, we will just start to release. Again, right there is a reset, very quick, actually very, very nice, standard trigger. Now I've never handled the trigger, let's show the reset, right there. I've never handled the trigger on a fully automatic FAL or an original military. This was an import gun, so I don't know if the trigger was improved for the commercial market. It may have been, but at least on this particular model, that's a very nice trigger. So here on the HK91, you just have a little bit of take up right there. Again, not very much travel. Slightly back into a nice clean break. Showing the reset on the trigger, again, just a little bit of travel here to the reset, and then again, a nice clean break at about 6 pounds. Again, a really nice trigger, and really feeling them both. I can't tell you which one I like more. They're both very nice. Again, these are both commercial triggers and commercial guns for the commercial market, so they could have been lightened up for, of course, the exportation or importation. to help with sales and make them more of a sporting rifle, but as it sits, they're both very nice. Now let's go ahead and talk about the stock. Starting up here with the FAL, of course, this is that durable plastic Bakelite type configuration. Very sleek and slimline, especially here in the comb, with a nice rubberized, it's kind of a rubber or hard plastic, shoulder pad. So very nice, increases your length of pull. Very nice and comfortable. Your face just kind of melds right in here into this recess very well. Very comfortable to shoulder and to shoot. Of course, they did have different variations of the buttstock, whether it was a skeletonized folding stop in the paratrooper configuration. They did also make these out of wood. Now, in the HK91 or the G3, this is the A4 paratrooper or vehicle driver collapsing stock. You see this little triangular switch down here at the bottom, which you can rotate and then collapse the stock in, giving an overall very small package of the firearm. And of course, you do have a very aggressive shoulder pad on the stock here. It's all metal and kind of has a meat pulverizer feeling to it. So good old German classic design there. In contrast, here is the standard HK91 or the G3 shoulder stock, which is the standard for the standard configuration of the rifle, more comparable to this one here on the FAL. You do have these two little holes here, which is what will put your retaining pins for disassembly in those, so you don't lose those in the field. And also your sling loop is right here. So let's get into the field strip basically of the FAL. So as I mentioned before, there is a takedown lever here, and this is really a pretty simple process. Go ahead and push that up, and then that will allow the two halves to sort of rotate on this pin here. Now you can remove this screw. I'm not going to do that. This is an almost pristine import model. I don't want to start taking screwdrivers to it and marring it up in any way. But when we do the next video on the FAL, I will get more into an in-depth field strip because it will have a built G1 and not as good condition as this. So I will take some tools to that one. Now up here on the top, you do have a dust cover. The dust cover can just slide off. And of course, you can just remove that. And this is just a stamped steel piece of metal. So we'll set that aside. You can then grab your bolt and pull it out towards the rear. Now one thing I forgot to mention is, of course, you want to make sure that it's cocked before you do that, or you're going to be fighting that hammer, which is what just happened to me. Not a big deal, but I just went ahead and manually cocked it back down, which I'll need to do anyway to get the thing back together. And here we have the bolt carrier and the bolt, and basically the bolt goes towards the rear. It's a tilting locking bolt, so as you see it kind of moving back and forth there, it does, when it's in battery, tilt to lock. And of course I can go ahead and bring it back. Now the firing pin spring and firing pin are very, very tight in this model, so you need to push that in when it's in the rearward position to allow it to basically pop out, which I'm not going to be able to do right now, but again, when I do my future FAL video, I'll have more detail on that. Now your buffer and springs are housed in the stock, which is what this little bolt rat tail is for, to basically coincide with that. And there is a little recess here in the back of the receiver to allow that to travel through and conjoin up with your recoil spring. Now up here at the front, I did mention earlier that little gas plug, and all you're going to do, there's a little detent pin here you're going to push and then give the gas plug a turn, and once it is turned 90 degrees, the gas plug will come off, and then here is your piston and spring. So what essentially is happening is this is sitting in here inside your gas tube, which we mentioned earlier towards the beginning of this video. Now this little plunger is sitting up in here, and what happens is when those gases come up, any of those gases that are left, and this is sitting housed up against almost the receiver face, any gases that are left are going to push on that plunger and cause it to go forward. And you see, imagine where my fist is the receiver face, and past my fist here is where the bolt is sitting. So as the gases push that back, it's going to push into the receiver and knock that bolt, sending it to the rear. Again, short stroke gas piston, so that's what that system means. The piston has a short stroke, doesn't go the entire length of the receiver with the bolt carrier, and then it pushes your bolt to the rear under recoil. Your return spring returns it back into battery, and it's ready for another shot. So again, gas piston. That's how you basically will just take that plug off, pull this out, clean it. Make sure that you aren't getting a lot of carbon built up in there, because remember, the dirtier it gets, the more you're going to have to mess with that gas port adjustment knob up here at the front. Okay, here on the HK91, we do have two cross pins here on the back. I'll go ahead and push those out from the other side and pull those out. Set those aside. Now the stock is pretty tight on here, but that'll come right off the rear. Now this is your recoil spring and guide rod, which is attached to the stock itself. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the lower trigger group housing does rotate and pull off. If you want to take the trigger group out itself, you can basically push this up into the vertical position and take your cross pin out. Here it's actually your selector switch or your safety lever, and then the trigger group basically just pulls right out of the trigger frame. So it's that easy to switch out your trigger group if you want to put in like a matched trigger group or anything from hkparts.com. So it's really that simple. Setting that aside, we'll go ahead and grab the charging handle. We'll use that to get the bolt out the rear of the receiver here. So I'll go ahead and pull that out the back. And then of course, here's a receiver. Of course, here's your receiver cocking tube barrel assembly. So we'll go ahead and set that aside. So right here on the bolt, this is your basically bolt carrier group, and this is the arm. It's not a piston, but it's just an arm that sits right up here, and the cocking tube right up against the I'll pull this out to show you. So it's sitting right in here inside the receiver, and then this arm of course is sitting right up here, and then as you charge, the cocking handle hits it and pushes it back. So that's really all that is there for. People usually mistake it for a gas piston. Now the bolt head itself does have two little rollers that sit in here, and then so when the bolt head is retracted back into the bolt body, it forces both of those rollers to then pop out and lock, and those lock into recesses inside the receiver. So if you've ever picked one of these things up and you try and crank on that charging handle, at least initially it's going to feel really tight, because what you're doing is you're fighting, those rollers are locked in, you're fighting them to basically disengage into a linear position. The bolt head will come forward, allowing them to move out, and then they kind of just sit in the bolt body, and you have those two rollers that assist in bringing the bolt back to the rear of the receiver and then back forward again. So that's my very crude demonstration of how that works. But so you do have a lot more gases and energy required to be pushed back into the firearm to actuate the firearm to do that. Now you will have, and down in here you will see a gap, especially when the bolt head is closed. You will see a gap in here. You usually take that measurement when it's inside the rifle. If you push this in and let the bolt head come back into the bolt body without it being inside the receiver, it can be pretty difficult to get that thing, basically pulled back out of the bolt body. So with this inside the firearm and the bolt head pushed to the rear, you do have to check the bolt gap, because these rollers will wear over time. And if your bolt gap is out of spec, you can create undue and early wear on the firearm that you basically necessarily do not want to have happen. So whether you have a SETME, a C308 from Century Arms, a PTR91 or an HK91, you definitely want to keep consistent checks, get some feeler gauges and check that bolt gap to make sure you're not going out of spec and start damaging your gun. Well, that is all the time I have for you today on these. Thank you so much for coming and checking this video out. If you enjoyed that, please let me know by hitting that like button. If you want to see more videos like this, go ahead and subscribe to our channel. We do comparison videos like this pretty regularly. Both of these rifles have a lot of pluses and minuses. Go ahead and let me know down in the comment section which one you prefer and the reasons why. So again, this is Chris with Marksman Shooting Sports in Westfield, Indiana, and CheapGunsUSA.com. You are watching Marksman TV. We will see you next time.